living in a foreign country for a while and you are a bit disappointed that just breathing the air has not made you fluent yet, or you may be thinking about moving to a country and hoping that just the fact of being there is going to help you learn the language by some magic miracle, then please watch this video until the end because I am going to explain what I call the expat trap of language learning. Now, you would be surprised to know that according to some of the latest data we've got, only about 29% of the expats living in a foreign country say they can speak the language of their new host country very well. Only 29%. Now, if you are 50 plus, then that percentage goes down to 23%. It means that for every four expats, we literally have about one that it's going to be able to communicate in the language. And I see this every single day because I live in Geneva, in Switzerland. Geneva, it's an extremely international city. We've got the UN office here in Geneva. We have a large number of international organizations, such as WHO or WMO. And we also have the European headquarters of many American and international companies. So that means Geneva is an extremely international place where, yes, the official language is French, but there's so many people that speak English, and it's perfectly possible to get by in life without knowing much French. Now, the first time I realized this is when I was working actually at the United Nations, at the UN office here in Geneva, where I would have all of these colleagues who had been in Geneva for maybe like 20, 30, 40 years, and their French was very, very basic. And they would all talk about how excited they were about learning French when they arrived, but then that excitement kind of disappeared throughout time because they realized they didn't really need it for their lives. They could just go on with their own lives in English and not have too many problems. Now, today we're going to explore a little bit more why that's happening and why it can become a real trap if you are trying to really learn the language. Now, before we go ahead, if this is the first time you see me, my name is Esther. I am a doctor in language education. I've studied 9 languages throughout my life. I trained and worked as a professional translator and interpreter for years. I also spent more than 10 years teaching languages across Europe. And now I help serious adult learners so I can help them understand better how their brain learns languages and the most efficient strategies they need to use if they want to start making real progress. Before we go back into the main reasons why expats are actually very often struggling to learn the language of their new countries, I'm going to give you some data about how long it actually takes to learn a language, which I think is quite interesting. This data, you may have come across it before. It comes from the Foreign Service Institute in the US, and it looks at the average number of lessons that students will need in order to become relatively fluent. So I think they were aiming for like a B2 C1 level in any language. And they realized that depending on the difficulty of the language, some languages for English native speakers would be easier. So that would take about 600 to 750 hours, while other languages that may be more difficult, like Japanese or Arabic, they may need up to about 2,000 hours of instruction in order to become relatively fluent in the language, right? Now, those numbers are already telling you something quite clearly that becoming fluent in a language is not something that happens in 3 months, right? So those methods that say, become fluent super fast, you can do it in 2 weeks. Well, any respectable research we've got out there actually proves quite the contrary. It proves it's going to take quite a lot of time. And if you are an adult, it's probably going to take you quite a lot of effort. And I would say the older we get, the more effort it's probably going to take because it will recruit different learning systems that we don't get access anymore as we get older. So I don't want you to get depressed with this information, but I just want you to be very realistic about the expectations you can have. Because I think setting realistic expectations, it's the first step in making progress. Because otherwise you're going to get very frustrated very fast without a reason for it, because you may just be following the completely normal learning curve of any average student. It's just not going to be aligned with those promises that people are making online. But at least you need to know that you are probably within the normal time span in order to become fluent. Now, Let's look at the different reasons why expats usually really struggle to learn the language of their host country. The first reason is what I call the expat bubble. Now, what we see very often in regions or cities or areas that have a lot of expats, it's what we call linguistic ghettoization. And that means that all of these different linguistic groups of expats are going to create their own little ghettos, their own little groups, and they're going to keep hanging out with each other. They're not going to go so much out there and try to meet people from the country. Now, the older you get, the more difficult it is to get out there and meet new people. Not necessarily because people are not going to be nice or anything like that. It's just because, when you move to a city and you are 20, there's a lot of young people out there wanting to make friends. When you move to a city and you're 40, 50, 60, normal local people already have their lives and their groups of friends, and they're not necessarily interested in, making new friendships or adding new people to the group. So that it's already a difficulty that a lot of the expats I work with actually encounter. And it can be a limitation on how much practice they can get in the language. But that also means that your brain it's going to look for the path of least resistance because it's difficult to find new people, because when you talk to them you feel uncomfortable. You're just going to avoid those moments, and instead you're going to start just hanging out with people that speak your language or a language that you can actually use, usually English. And this happens as well at work, because work for most expats, it's actually going to be in English. They will speak English at work, they will speak English at home or their own mother tongue at home. And the only exposure they actually get to the language, it's just through like a few tiny interactions, maybe at a cafe, maybe in the public transport, they'll hear an announcement, they may put on the news, but there isn't really so many opportunities to practice the language, even if you are living in the country. Now, unless you create those opportunities, which is something that I always encourage my students to do because they are already living in a country surrounded by people who speak the language. They just need to leverage that and start creating opportunities where they can actually talk to people in the language. Another important reason it's what we call the difference between instrumental and integrative motivation. Instrumental motivation would be your motivation, for example, to learn the language if you move to the country to find a job, right? If you go to a new country, you don't speak the language and you need the language in order to get a job and to have money at the end of the month to pay for your bills, that it's a very, very strong motivation that it's going to keep you learning at a faster pace because it's about survival. While what we have when we talk about expats is usually an integrative motivation. It means that you'll want the language in order to integrate with the locals. But the stakes aren't sufficiently high for expats because you eventually already have your bubble, you have the people that you can ask questions to, that you can meet, you have your social life. So even if you think you really want to integrate with locals, that's what you're telling yourself. But the reality you are creating around you, it's telling your brain the opposite. Your brain doesn't need that language. So why bother? Why am I going to make an effort to make this language available if the person is not using it that much? And of course, here we need to also take into consideration social rejection. That, as I've said before, it's very difficult to maintain a very high level of motivation to integrate with the locals if the perception that you have is that the locals don't want you, that the locals don't feel comfortable with you around, they have to make too much effort to understand me. I can't really speak about very advanced topics. I'm sure they're getting bored. I take too long to find the words. All of those beliefs that you've got are also contributing to your brain thinking that it's not worth making the effort to learn a language. And that helps us move to yet another reason, which is what I call the stress memory loop. And it has to do with a tiny substance we've got that is produced in our brains that is called cortisol. And you may have heard me speaking about it because it's one of the most important chemicals that are going to directly impact our ability to learn and to use a language. Now, when we get really stressed out, our cortisol levels are going to raise. when cortisol rises, it's like a toxic substance, let's put it, for certain parts of the brain. It's going to be not very good for the hippocampus. Hippocampus, it's the part of your brain, kind of deep inside, where the learning happens. And if that part it's flooded with cortisol, it's going to have a very hard time learning. But cortisol also going to have an impact on your prefrontal cortex, which is like the CEO of the brain. It's the part of the brain that it's handling, the planning of things, analyzing, filtering out problems. It's doing everything at the same time. Super important when you are speaking because it's interpreting the context, it's planning what you're going to say, it's sending the signals like what words do we need now. If that part is also flooded with cortisol, it's not going to function very well either. So that's really going to limit your ability to learn and to speak the language. Now, why is this important? It's because when you have just moved to a country, you have to understand that moving it's a highly stressful period in your life. And what we see in research is that sometimes when the brain has been under a lot of stress for relatively long periods of time, the cortisol levels kind of become very high permanently. And those high levels of cortisol may actually be having a physical impact on these two parts of the brain. You may be inhibiting them or even shrinking them. So, what I see quite often is that students move to the country, they go through all of this stress of like moving, integrating, like all the bureaucracy, everything. And at the same time, they're trying to learn the language, and their brain just can't cope with so much. And then on top of that, they are really putting a lot of pressure on themselves to learn the language faster and to try to integrate. So, even just the stress of trying to learn faster so that you can integrate faster may be making your brain learn slower because it's limiting the ability of these two regions. And not only, but it's the two most important parts of the brain that are involved in learning and that are going to be heavily impacted if you keep your cortisol levels very, very high. And finally, and this takes me to the last reason of this expat trap, it's what I call the analytical brain that comes with age. We know from research that the idea of that critical period where you can learn very well a language and after that you're not able to learn, that's been debunked. So we do know it's more like a progressive decline. But, however, what we do now see from research is that adult brains are going to learn very differently from younger brains. And the older the brain gets, the more differently the strategies that it's going to need. Because older brains are going to rely much more on declarative knowledge, on declarative information. They're going to need to understand the rules before they're able to apply them. Where in younger brains, you may not need to understand the rules, you may just be able to pick them up and imitate. And that is very, very important because we have all of these rules that we want to be able to apply. Now, we know the rules because we've taken some language classes and they've explained to us how this thing works. And we are trying to perform so well that we are getting anxiety. We get into this performance anxiety. And if that happens one time and we have a bad experience, that's going to be like a negative loop in our brain, where every time we see ourselves in a similar situation, our brain it's going to raise the cortisol again, anxiety, stress, it's going to go up, and that it's going again to stop or slow down our brain's ability to learn and to use the language. So you can see already that this is a vicious cycle, right? Like the more aware you are of all of the rules, the more perfectionist you are, the more you want to speak properly because you want to integrate, you want people to like you want to be able to contribute as a normal social being to the society you are living in. But that pressure you're putting on yourself, it's raising cortisol, which is making you less able to use the language, which in turn makes you feel bad, which is going to raise the anxiety, raise the cortisol levels, and it's never ending. And I unfortunately see so many of my students coming to me with this exact same problem, where they've been living in a country for a number of years, they've been trying really, really hard to learn the language, to integrate, but they have developed this very negative loop around using and learning the language that it's half responsible for the results they are not seeing. Eventually, in many, many cases, the difference between you being able to learn the language and be able to use the language fairly fluently. And you just feeling stuck all the time, feeling very frustrated, feeling very negative, and feeling like you don't deserve speaking up just yet. The difference it's very, very often in your brain and in how you are framing the entire situation. Of course, as we've seen, there are some elements that are going to make learning the foreign language of your new host country more difficult because, of all the circumstances, and especially if you are an English speaker, everyone is going to try to switch to English and you're going to be like, I really want to speak the language. Please give me a chance. But eventually, you are in control of your learning and of the situation. And that's what I want you to take away from this. You may become immersed in the language because you're so obsessed with it, like teenagers do, and just study the language all the time and become fluent. And you may be thousands of kilometers away from the country where the language is spoken. Or you might be living in a city surrounded by people that speak the language, but your mindset has stopped you from actually leveraging those resources. So, what I want you to do today, if you are in this situation, is to start thinking about your own context. Start thinking about how you feel about it and identify which of the reasons that we've explored today may be having the highest impact on the results you have got so far in the language. And also start thinking about the different strategies, different things you could do to change this situation, especially if you are serious about learning a language. Again, I work with a lot of retired expats who are struggling with all of these things. And it's very impressive how, by just addressing some of the things we've discussed today, they manage to see a difference and to start literally speaking the foreign language within a few months of working with me. And I won't take all the merit for that because they had been learning the language for so long. They have all of this passive knowledge about the language. But it's very, very often some of these factors that are stopping the brain from fully leveraging their language ability. And if you are actually a retired expat, you might be interested in watching this video next, where I explained the very special difficulties that older brains may have when they are trying to learn a foreign language. Thank you again. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done it yet, and I'll see you in the next video.